privilege to have been asked to be part of this event and part of this commemoration, and to be invited to talk to Sally Magnusson about this wonderful book about the Highland Clearances, Music in the Dark. So I think we'll just get straight into it. Yeah. Sally, as you know, we're here tonight to commemorate the incredible spirit and bravery of the community of Coigach who resisted clearance, particularly the women. And I just wondered, when were you first aware of the Highland clearances as a concept even? When did they first come into your consciousness?
I don't know about my consciousness. I suspect I learned about them a bit at school, although I don't really remember that. I can remember the dates of James IV of Scotland and what he did as the Renaissance king, but I don't remember learning anything about the people of Scotland at all. But I imagine the clearances came into that. But when it really entered my ken properly was through my mother, who used to tell a story about her granny's family. Her granny was Annie McKechnie, and she lived up in the Isle of Mull. And she had come down to Glasgow at the age of 13, evicted in what my mother suspected was the Highland clearances, although it had never been made very explicit at that time. And I did a lot of genealogical research to find out what the details were. But the story that my mother had always remembered about her granny was that they had lived in a little community near Tobermory, and they had very few possessions, but they did have a cow. And that cow was, their prized possession, because it meant everything. If you had a cow, you could live, you could survive. And they were being thrown out of their home and refused to go. And she said the cow was taken from them as it was taken from other people in the township who refused to give up their cow. And all the cows were put on Calve Island, which is not actually anything to do linguistically with calf, but it has stuck in my mother's memory. It was Calve Island, and the cows were all put there. And she said that her granny came out the door a few days later and looked out, and there, plodding towards them, was their cow, which had apparently swum all the way across the Sound of Mull from Calve Island and away up the headland and across to their croft. And they lost it in the end, but it had impressed itself, because my great-grandmother went to Glasgow at the age of 13, so she must have been quite young when it happened, but it had meant such a lot to her that the cow had come back. And when I went and did my researches many years later, I went round asking people if cows could swim that far. Was this a plausible story? And I found in the records that there had been a cow for this family, and B, that the farmers, laughing their heads off, said, of course, cows could swim. And they did have a homing instinct, and that cow would have come home. So that was the story. It's always story with me. That was the story that had locked itself in my consciousness. And when I came to write this story, it was my great-granny's life that I began to weave into a different story of clearance in a different part of Scotland.
Wonderful. The cow that came home. Yes. And when you went to Mull to look into your family history, was that when you first thought you might like to write a novel about the clearances, or did that come later, or was it a seed, do you think, that was planted then?
I don't think so, because I had no thought of writing novels at that time, actually. The novel writing has been relatively recent, and this was quite a few years ago. It fed into, actually, the memoir I wrote about my mother's dementia, actually, the story of her antecedents in Mull, and that's that's where I began to kind of write about it. But the idea of writing about the clearances, I was writing novels by that time. This is my third, and looking for something that I could do in Scotland. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, I remembered a film that my husband had been trying to make decades before. My husband's a filmmaker, but he spends his life not making films, as many filmmakers find themselves in that position. You know, they're always hustling to try and get money to the latest great idea. And this one didn't come off, but it was an idea he had got from John Preble, and it was based on the, as it was called at the time, the massacre of the Rosses up in Strathcarron, and a pamphlet that had been written by a man called Donald Ross, who I actually bring in slightly as a character in the book, who had written about the terrible attack by the police and militia really on the women, the Ross women of Greenyards in Strathcarron in 1854. And the film didn't happen, but we were down in England at the time, and we called our fourth child Ross to remind us of that time, because he got quite excited about the story, because it was a very good story. And somehow that it all came together when I was looking for a subject, and I thought I must look up that pamphlet, I must try and find it, what really happened. And I hadn't really realised that it was women, that the attack was on women. And I thought, I've never heard of this. I've never heard of women being out front when the eviction notices are being delivered. Mm-hmm. And that was the beginning of me realising that could be a story, that could be a novel. Yeah. And it was a case of trying to work out which angle to take on it.
Yeah. And eventually, of course, it became this. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, could you outline for anybody who hasn't read it what the premise of the story is, and give us an introductory reading?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a reread. I mean, how would you describe it? I mean, it takes place 40 years or 30 years after the Greenyards clearance, and 40 years after the one at Glencalvie, which was 10 years before. And they were two townships in the Strath, known as Strathcarron, which has Glencalvie up at one end, and down at the other end is Ardguy, and the nearest town, bigger conurbation was Tame. And it's really all linked with what happened here, because what we know happened here happened the year before the Strathcarron clearances, where the sheriff's officers made 5 attempts to deliver eviction notices here, and each time they were thwarted, and they went away in the end, never to come back. Across on the other side of Scotland, their time of clearance was coming. It had happened at Glencalvie in 1845, and then the Laird of Candice died, his heir took over, there was various other clearances happening, but Greenyards knew that their time would come. And eventually it came to them as well. But it seemed to me that when you look at what the women were doing in Strathcarron, how they were eventually mown down by the police, and when you read the letters between the fiscal and the Lord Advocate, the sheriff's officers, and all these people kind of writing to each other at the time, it's clear that what had happened in Coigach had really shaken up the authorities. They were absolutely sick to the teeth of being humiliated by women, frankly, and they were determined by the time they got to Greenyards in 1854 to make sure this never happened again, to teach them a lesson. And it's quite explicit in some of the letters, especially between the Sheriff Principal and the Lord Advocate, who is assured by the Sheriff Principal that they will go in this time with vigour and I've sort of done a slight pastiche of the kind of things that are in these letters are in the book. So, what happened here had a genuine impact, I think, on what happened in Strathcarron. And the book tells that story, but it takes a while to get round to it, because by the time the book opens, we are in a completely different part of Scotland. We're in the town of Rutherglen, which is where my great-granny ended up after she came down from the Isle of Mull and went to Rutherglen in search of clean air, because the squalor in Glasgow in the second half of the 19th century was almost indescribable. I found this when I was writing The Ninth Child, actually, which has got scenes in the tenement housing at that time in Glasgow. And I wondered when I was describing it if it just wouldn't look too over the top to describe the vermin and the overcrowding and the people sitting without lights and without food and without furniture, and that's how some people had to live. Now, I don't think my great-granny was in these straits, but she began to lose her children one by one by one by one, and out of 4 children, 4 boys, only my grandfather survived. And she was desperate to save the second eldest. And she moved the family. She lost her own husband to TB as well. And she managed to move the family to Rutherglen, which was across the Clyde. It wasn't quite so industrialised at that time. There were still green fields. You could still see Catherine Braes in the distance. And she thought that this was a place where she might save the life of the one boy who had TB, but she thought could be saved. And she went into a tenement in Regent Street, it was called, and tried to save that boy. And the Jamesina Ross character, I found as I was writing, sort of morphed into the woman that I began to imagine my great-grandmother might have been like, because my mother used to say she was quite a difficult woman. And when I began to think about these women, no wonder they were difficult, When you think what they had to bear and what they had to do to live and to enable their families to live, I think there was a hardness, the Glasgow woman that enabled them to survive. But I was then interested in what would make you like that, and I realised how many of these Glasgow women at that time in the 1860s, 70s, 80s were Highlanders, had come down from the Highlands, had been cleared very often, were into the squalor of urban Scotland, and dealing with, we think what they left behind, however hard life was in a township, and we mustn't romanticise it, but you did have fresh air, you did have beauty. You could get up in the morning in April and hear the birds and the curlews, the larks, to go from that to what the Glasgow tenements were like at that time, must have done something deep to your soul.
It must have been a form of trauma, really. But you weave that beautifully into the story, because it's not simply a story of the community that is being cleared. It's a much bigger story. It's a story of the diaspora. It's a story of Scotland in the 19th century. And further, as you bring in Neil Monroe, it's a story of emigration as well. And this huge story you tell with these 2 main characters of Jamesina and Neil. But I wonder, would you like to give a reading first,
yes,
or will we?
Yes. So this is We thought we'd do this one just because it sort of sets up. I mean, as you can see, it's further on in the book, so we're kind of unpacking her life to get back to this. Jamesina's, it's clear from the beginning that she's disfigured, her face is disfigured, and her mind is beginning to fracture a little bit. And we are eventually getting back to why that might have happened. And this is the beginning of the attack in Green Yards. And I thought I would do a little bit that just mentions, is it Coigach? Coigach, is that right?
Coigach.
Coigach? Right, I'll get it wrong. Okay. Forgive me. I have a Gaelic great granny, but that's as near as I get. It was the kind of morning on the threshold of dawn when you sense everything holding its breath. The ground soft and expectant, the air eager for the sun, the stillness pregnant with vitality, but not quite there yet. Any day now the trees would explode and flowers shoot from the earth and toads make their bid for freedom and scents assail you and the rowdy geese roister home. But for the moment, the land was waiting. She was waiting too. They were all waiting, maybe 60 folk in lines 4 or 5 deep, very still, very quiet, very alert, waiting for the light, waiting for the policeman to tramp the last couple of miles down the track to the Green Yards boundary with the eviction notices, those dreaded papers written in a legal English that most of the folk whose lives were so hurt by them would have struggled to understand. They required the main tenants to flit and remove themselves, their bairns, family, servants, subtenants, cotters and dependents, their cattle, goods and gear, and to leave the said subjects void and read, that the pursuer may then enter there too, possess and enjoy the same in time coming. Something like that. She had it off by heart once. Possess and enjoy. Hard to imagine the Laird of Kindees enjoying old Lizzie's house. Most of their own men had stayed away from Fiarnach Field, same as they did at Glencalvy all those years before, when the women stopped the sheriff at the bridge. Women were always to the fore when the notices arrived at Highland townships. There must have been a first time, somewhere, sometime, when one woman had looked at another woman and said, "It's up to us to stop them." And maybe they'd set light to a notice and jeered some nervous message boy of a sheriff's officer back the way he'd come, and maybe nobody got put in jail for it, and maybe the word had spread to other places that this was the way to do it. However it started, by the time the Strathcarron townships were being cleared, it was accepted that resistance would be led by the folk least likely to be arrested. In the eyes of some men, holding off the summonses from being delivered was as much women's work as stirring the oats. And maybe that suited them. Maybe it suited a few of them to disappear when trouble came. They had trouble enough in their lives, these folk, and they were weary of it. But the women never hesitated, not that she ever saw anyway. If they could stop the notices getting into the hands of the tenants named on them, they might win the community another season, another crop cycle, a few more months or even years before the authorities came back to try again. And that was always worth it. It had been worth it at Glencalvy, even if they did find themselves trudging to Coigach's graveyard in the end on a bleary May morning with their homes on their backs. Rumours of removal had been worming their way around Green Yards for most of the year past. Reports also arrived from other townships in the same position, and spirits rose or fell with the fate of them. Grave tidings came from Knoydart, way over in the west, but folk were heartened by accounts of successful resistance in Coigach by Lord Lochbroom. The sheriff's officers had gone there 5 times to deliver the summonses, and 5 times they were thwarted. In the end, the Coigach woman took the notices off one of the officers, stripped every stitch of clothing from his back, and packed him off in his boat as naked as the day he was born. And that was that. The law never came back. They talked of little else at Green Yards that year. She can hear those women debating tactics yet, their voices, their faces, the ebb and flow of their arguments. Anne Munro thought humiliating the men into staying away was always the way to do it. Shaming was a useful weapon when you had no others, and Big Anne knew all about that. Young Margaret Mackenzie, quiet lassie, thoughtful blue eyes and a forest of freckles, was more likely to point out that men did not like being humiliated, and especially not, she would have thought, lairds and sheriffs. Would Coigach's success not make the law all the more determined elsewhere? Her sister Annie, freckly woman too, a bit older, always had to think the opposite, whatever Margaret thought. The women used to laugh about it. Annie said Margaret should hold her tongue until she had something sensible to say. The Coigach folk were in their homes yet, and if it could work in one place, it could work in another. Pointy-faced Hugh as a Chisholm said the thing was to wear the authorities down, never mind how long it took, because people were writing about Coigach and Knoydart in the newspapers, and it was making a lot of folk in Glasgow and Edinburgh uneasy. London too. Christy Ross was never one for recent argument. This time she's remembering Christy just folded her arms, big as hams, and said no sheriff was going to take her house off her that had just been thatched last summer and a beautiful job her man had made of it. But what about Knoydart, says Margaret Mackenzie. Knoydart, a peninsula they call it, which is a lovely word that Mr. Aird taught her, just lovely, Latin piney, almost an insula island, an almost island poking into the sea across from the Isle of Skye. When people wrote about Strathcarron being remote, they'd likely never tried getting to the townships along the sea fringe of Knoydart, which were being cleared that year to settle the debts of some laird, whichever one that was. A ship was arranged to carry the whole population off to Australia. Likely some of the Knoydart folk were glad to get away. They'd had a terrible time of it in the potato famines and were poor as poor. But not everyone wanted to go. There were all sorts of people who didn't think much of their chances of surviving the journey. Sick folk, old folk, women expecting bairnies, nursing mothers, and others who were just plain obstinate about not going to a place they knew nothing about when nobody had asked them in the first place. When the ship anchored off Skye, plenty of them did as they were told and got into the boats to be ferried across, but others refused and took to the hills. The factor's men went and destroyed every house after that, whether it belonged to those who'd sailed or those who stayed, and they were left with nothing. And then that chapter goes on to talk about the 2 times that in Strathcarron they had visits from the sheriff officers, and they managed to banter, the sheriff's men away, basically. But then it was the third time they'd gathered to resist the summonses. But the atmosphere this morning was tenser, with none of the usual banter and bravado. The whistling that summoned them from the boys and girls who'd been planted all over the hills and all over the approach roads up from Tain and Alness, who had a sort of process of whistling from one hill to another so that the message got passed along. The whistling that summoned them had been clamorous. Not just 1 or 2 sheriff's men, but dozens of police constables had been seen spilling drunkenly out of their carriages at the point where the road from Ardguy gave out, and anyone pressing forward must do it on foot. Now the lookouts were streaming back and had been told to keep out of the way. Sounds from the trees, brushed leaves, the crack of twigs. Careless feet approaching. She's back there again. A horde of black uniforms looming out of the grey wood and lining up in untidy rows before them. Shock at how many they were up close. A man at the front shouting he was the sheriff, and they had to clear the way so that his officer could serve lawful summonses of removal on the tenants. Christy Ross bustling forward to show the sheriff some letter she had that proved, so she was shouting, that the removal had not been authorised. Batons raining on Christy's head, her own breath buckling at the sight of it. Christy's cap shredded, blood all over, women screaming as she goes down, Big Anne bellowing, Big Anne on the ground. Policemen hitting out, women scattering, she's running too, Grace in front of her. Screams everywhere, roars everywhere, policemen everywhere, flailing arms in uniforms, Grace falling. Don't touch her, don't you dare touch my Grace. She's pummeling a policeman with her fist. She's trying to get Grace to wake up. She's shaking her shoulders. Wake up, Grace, wake up. Fosca de Hulen, please open your eyes. So that's a flavour of the beginning of the Strathcallan battle.
I think that describes It's a beautiful reading, thank you. There's so much in that reading, so many different areas we could go, but I think it really shows the reality of the individuals, the individual women. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us listening think, I know Christy Ross, or I know Big Anna Munro, you know, and you can remember people like that growing up. But you also show the landscape they came from and what they lost. And you referenced the fact that there was poverty. We're not saying that there was no poverty, that life wasn't difficult. So huge amount in there. But as you say, that's some way into the book, and this is when we begin to understand, get a real understanding of what has happened to Jamesina Ross, the central character of the book. Because when we first meet her, she's an adult woman, and this is her remembering back to the critical point in her life. And Jamesina, as you suggested about your great-grandmother, is not an easy woman, is she? And she has, the two main characters are Jamesina and Neil, this man who comes first of all as her lodger. And they're tremendous characters in the way they complement and react to each other, and they reveal themselves to us through their responses to each other. But I feel so sorry for Neil, because he's this lovely man, and he's become a lodger of this very difficult woman who's not at all friendly to him. And he's always trying to be nice to her and things, but, you know, at one point we're told Jamesina has an exceedingly sharp tongue. And a little later he tries to pay her a compliment, and we're told Jamesina is extremely bad at taking compliments. And yet in the course of the book we come to understand why she is the way she is, and he helps put her back together. Yes. And you know, I think you've answered the question of where, because I was going to ask, where did Jamesina come from? And I think obviously
I think that is, and it's interesting because it wasn't in any sense that she was fully formed when I started her, because I took her from childhood, and I knew the kind of child she was, and it was important to me that we should have lively, intelligent children in Highland townships. You know, they had good education. The parish schools at the time were very good, and they had a curriculum that I was quite astonished to see the breadth of the curriculum in the school. You know, the Glencalvy school that you know she would have gone to, and you know the schoolmaster was teaching English, Gaelic, Latin, geography, book sort of book learning. You know, how you what is book? Sort of accounting, kind of. I think it was, arithmetic, Bible studies. You know, it was a tremendously wide education, and girls went as well as boys, and of course nobody was forced to go, and there were lots of people lots of children that didn't get the opportunity. But those who did, those who, you know, the boys that could be spared from the field work and the girls from the domestic tasks, they would have had a good education, and there were older people as well. And there was a story in the Glencalvy school of I think I actually mentioned him in here, of a man of 103 who went to school every day and walked miles to get to school. So, you know, there's more that needs to. I couldn't find very much out about the education at that time, but it was clear that you could be educated living in one of these townships, which are so despised by, you know, the authorities, whether it was Glasgow, Edinburgh, or London.
Savages.
They were savages. and they were foreigners. And that I found particularly shocking, actually, to realise that in London, you know, the Trevelyan in London had a plan. He was in the Lord Trevelyan, he was in the cabinet there, and he had a plan which I could never find any proof that anything had ever happened about it, but it was to try and replace the Gaels with Germans, Teutons, because they were hard-working and would be much more productive than the Highlanders. And that's what Jamesina finds so hurtful, the idea that she is a foreigner. And she's been to school and she's learned some English, she's learned some Latin, and she's kind of adopted, mentored by the Free Church of Scotland minister, who was a real character, Gustavus Aird, real historical character, although Jamesina is fictional, so any interaction they have is of course fiction, but he did wander around on his pony round Strathcarron, round his parishioners, and it seemed to me perfectly likely that if there was a smart, happy, intelligent child there, he was interested in learning, then he would teach her. And that's how she came to learn Latin. And so all these decades later, as her mind is just beginning to fracture a little bit, it's the Latin that is still there. And this goes back to my mother, who also was a very bright, sparky girl who learned Latin. And when she eventually succumbed in her old age to dementia, she could still decline a Latin noun or conjugate a Latin verb at the drop of a hat. And so that's why there's kind of little bits of Latin all the way through. So to get back to the point, I could see Jamesina as a child, but I wasn't so sure what kind of adult she would be until I began to see my great-granny in her, and think that if she went down to Glasgow and she had experiences that so many of these women had, these migrant Highlanders had when they got to Glasgow, then she might easily become a harder, more embittered person in later life. That it took the likes of her lodger to begin to awaken the song that there had been in her life and the poetry, and she had dreamt of becoming a kind of poet or somebody who would be able to speak out about what had happened to her community and bear witness. She never had a chance to do that.
She said, because I'd noted that. Jamesina says that before the weary work of keeping bairns alive and her husband at arm's length, she dreamed of bearing witness to what had happened. And then when she ended up down in Glasgow and then in Rutherglen, all these things, life was so hard, she thought that dream was lost.
Yeah, but the songs were still in her, and actually what Neil is able to show her is that some of the songs that she had created when she was a young woman, before they were evicted, were the songs that he carried with him. He carried with him to the New World, and that music, was in fact, her music was the voice of the people.
Yes.
And that's tremendously important, and I think that's why Music in the Dark became the title of it, because there's something about the capacity of music, both to articulate the aspirations of a people, and also to speak deeply to the individual soul, and to heal it, as we find in the effect it can have on people with dementia and other neural conditions.
I mean, that's one of the several places where the book knits in quite a lot with your memoir of your mother, the role of music and remembering the role of words, of Latin, and even going right back to your original visit to Mill to look into the family history with your mother. And it's the idea of music in the dark. It's not just that Neil gets Jamesina to sing in the dark at night to calm her when she's distressed, but it's the idea that music can alleviate a spiritual darkness and the sort of cultural darkness that's the memory that's been hidden on a much wider level. And I think we can all think of tunes that bring us back to either our youth or early aspirations or to like aspects of our history. And there's so many levels that music matters.
It's interesting when we were thinking about title for the book, it was at the time when the Ukrainian invasion had not long started, and I don't know if you remember on the television screens for a while there was people had taken to basements for the first time, expecting bombardments in Kyiv at any moment, and there was a little girl who was singing down there, and she was singing their national songs in the darkness. And what it meant to people to hear their music, and that was literally in the darkness and metaphorically in the darkness as well. And I'd finished the book by that time, but I sort of thought that's what I mean by it. That's as well as exactly what you're describing, the spiritual ability of music.
Yes, Jamesina's, her tunes, some of her songs are in the book, and I wondered, are they songs or did you write those songs?
I wrote them terribly quickly as well, because I was very afraid of producing pastiche, and she would have. It's a very difficult. You probably know this from your own writing. It's difficult for an English-speaking writer to write about people whose natural language and who would have been talking in Gaelic and composing in Gaelic, and you're doing that in English, so you're already at a remove from the essence of a thing that can only ever be communicated in the native tongue. So if you're going to go into that territory, I think you have to try and do it with a relatively light touch, because if you imagine that you're succeeding, you're lost, I think. That was my excuse for not taking very long over it. And I just wanted to write songs that might look as if they had once been Gaelic. And I immersed myself in a book of Gaelic verse from various periods that have been translated into English, and just tried to hear a little bit of the rhythms and also a little bit of the kind of things that we're writing about. Some of the older Gaelic bards, the exactitude with which they describe the natural world, for instance. The precise note of a thrush in the morning, which is why one of the reasons from the Gaelic poetry that I realised that people in the townships, of course, they appreciated the natural beauty as much as everybody else, as much as we do today, because of the beauty of that poetry, even though I was only accessing it through English. So I just, in a few minutes, really wrote and didn't really change it very much, so that it wouldn't be a kind of heavy pastiche. But I gave in to the temptation. I've got a Gaelic colleague, got many Gaelic colleagues at work, because Scotland is half Gaelic in many ways, but the girl I work with most called Katrina McKinnon. and she read it for me to see, if it rang true for a Gael. And she said, "Would you like me to translate any of these poems back into the Gaelic?" And I thought, gosh, this is beginning to feel very meta here. But I said, "Go on then, try." And she took the one about the blackbird and she translated it into Gaelic for me. And then, as it were, then backwards again. And it meant I was able to use a little bit of her Gaelic in it. But I thought it was important to have some of that flavour in the book, so that we knew what it was that Jamesina had inside her.
She still had in her. And Neil knows it's there, and he's just trying to find it, isn't he? And I wanted to ask you a wee bit about Neil, because he really is this character. He's such a lovely character. And I just wondered, where did he come from?
Well, he came from my great-grandmother's actual lodger.
Oh.
So she did have a lodger, and he was an Irishman actually, but he came to stay. She did exactly as Jamesina does, in that she moved to Rutherglen. She took in washing. She was a washerwoman, and her boy died. And my grandfather was the oldest of the family, and he had moved out by then, and had his own family. And she, at a later age, probably in her 60s, took him this younger lodger, and they got married. And he outlived her by many years, and he became the woman that my mother called Papa. And she had the most wonderful memories of him. And she said he was just this lovely old gentleman. We've got a photograph of him. He had a big white moustache.
Did you have? I was going to say, did you have a moustache?
He did. He had a big white moustache, and he was slender, very slender figure. And in the photograph, he had a big long sort of black coat. And he was a shoemaker, and he made. My mother's brother, Archie Baird, eventually used to play for Aberdeen, but he was very interested in football from a young age, and this Papa made his football boots. But my mother always described him as being such a mild character, but she said he always got his own way with her granny, and he just knew how to wind around his little finger without giving the appearance that he was giving me. And I just thought that was such an interesting relationship to play with.
Yes.
But his life story too, he did go to New York as a child. He'd been taken to New York. He was Irish, but they went there in the I think potato famine, and he used to run the waterfront in New York, and then he went to work for a button factory. And my mother had such powerful memories of him describing the button factory and how awful it was, truly awful. And so I spent a lot of time in the pandemic. I knew New York a little bit, New Jersey, because I've got friends who live in Princeton. So I kind of knew a bit, but it was lockdown, so I couldn't go out there again and research. So I got into a very friendly relationship with a librarian in New York Public Library, who I kept sending endless questions to about buttons. Poor man. Clearly had never thought of a button in his life before, but he kindly went off and looked at it for me and sent what he could. And the conditions were absolutely appalling. And I managed to piece together how the process of how a button was made at that time, and the mortality rates, and until the industry, till the unions began to come in, and that wasn't really until the turn of the century. And they unionised some of these factories and had some of these practices. They went on strike and had them stopped. But But that's where Neil came from.
Now, I think maybe the gentleman in the audience might wish to turn away for a minute, because I think you've got a reading about,
No.
because as you say, Jamesina does marry her lodger, or they get married, but she's not 100% sure if she wants to get married again, is she?
I was interested in making an older woman the protagonist, which is not, I mean, it's been done more now, but in fiction it's not been a very common thing to take anybody older than, about 30 as your romantic heroine. So but I've always loved Olive Kittering, for instance. If any of you have read her, she's quite a sort of a grumpy older woman, and she also has a slightly mild-mannered husband now that I think about it as well, so maybe I borrowed some of him too. But I thought, could I do this? Could I take somebody from a lower class, a despised race, an older age, a disfigured personal appearance, a menopause? Could I roll all that up and still have a character that would be compelling enough? And then, having decided that I could, I then thought, well, let's imagine really what that somebody who has got to that age, she's 50 something in the novel, and has been through as much as she has, and suffered as much as she has, and come through it, and made a life for herself, and got her washing business going, and then at that point a man comes along.
Yes.
It's not going to be a love's young dream. There's going to be all sorts of weighings up of the pros and cons of that sort of thing. So that's what Jamesina does, and this is actually taking place. She's thinking back to the night that they'd got married, which is a few weeks before the start of the book. That night she gazed on him with a kind of awe as he slept. After all the misgivings and insecurities, what she'd not accounted for, not for 1 minute prepared herself for, was what it felt like to have him close. The particular pleasure of hearing the breath of another living being who was not Willie Bain, competing with her own, now slower, now faster, and feeling the vibrations of another chest rising and falling, as if, and here was the revelation, as if life could be born, the piling griefs of it, the disappointments and confusions of it, as long as this chest continued to rise and fall at her side. Add this then to the scales, not Paul's scales, or was it Saul? Not Zeus's scales weighing out godly portions of death, just the ones Mr. Pinkerton has for weighing out tea. Marriage scales. A brass weight on one side for having to put up with the heaving about on nights you are not in the mood for worship. This to include the general nuisance of not being able to claim some peace in your own bed whenever you feel like it, or help sleep on its way with a mouthful of something that is no business of his. Another weight for the times you're so hot and bothered you can hardly bear another body within 2 yards of you under any circumstance whatsoever. A weight on top of that for having to put up with a man you still think of as a boy sometimes, really you can't help it, waltzing in and taking charge in your own house, complaining about not having a mirror, dragging you to see a head doctor without a by your leave, maddening you with his implacable placidity, or placid implacability. Which is it? Same Latin root. Plac something? Don't know. Should know. Placary maybe? To do with pleasing? He pleases me. Yes, he does. He pleases me a lot of the time. Most of the time. But it's aggravating to have him going on and on with his have you remembered to do this and do that. Although he tries not to. She can see that. And him always thinking quicker, working out bills faster, likely able to turn his hand to darning a sock better if he's ever let loose in it, which he never will be, not in a million years. down go the scales, clunk. Then you start on the other side, and there are times you can't think of a single thing to put there. Not a thing. Peace and quiet's all you want. Peace to scream out your grief in the night if you feel like it. Let me alone, you want to say. You do say it sometimes. Give me back my surly widowhood, my solitude, my routines, my regrets, my defences. But then there are other times you look at him lying the way he is now, so tidy and quiet and solid, and you start pouring the tea or whatever it is, sugar maybe, into the grocer's bowl on the other side of the scales, and you can't stop. You're pouring to the brim, the bowl's overflowing, you've got tea leaves and sugar all over the place, and still you're pouring. The weight of your head in the crook of an arm, the touch of a punctured thumb on your forehead, a steady voice when agitations come in the night, salt in the potatoes, primroses in the sugar bowl, a song in the dark, a feather dipped in ink, the colour of the night sky, the glimmer of an understanding that it might be safe to visit the person you used to be, the person you stopped being when a policeman's baton swung at your head and Willie Bain took his vicious pity on you, and your children left you and your songs died, and the sort of dream you never dreamed could happen, happened, because that's how life takes the dreamers sometimes. The beginnings of a sense. Put this in your scales, that it might be safe to go there all the same, one step at a time, because when you come back, you know he will still be here.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience just in a wee minute, but I just wanted to look at something else that Jamesina says. She said, as you said yourself, I thought I would get so many people singing my songs or reading my words that nobody would forget what has been done to people in these Highland glens, or try to excuse them in the name of improvement. And I think, I know certainly in my reading, I have come across a few instances in articles, chapters about the clearances, where the people are reduced to economic units, and it's all about economics and agricultural improvement. And I think sometimes that non-fiction of that sort, particularly academic history, can allow us to look away from the individuals and the individual suffering. But I think this book, this work of fiction, absolutely does not let us look away from the individual suffering. So thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I think we can have a few minutes of questions from the audience. I'm sure there'll be lots of things I haven't asked that you would like to ask.
Stunned into silence.
Yes.
I really liked your portrait of Gustavus Eyre. I've known about Gustavus Eyre all my life, but I've only ever seen or heard about him as an old man, and I just wondered how you decided to go about portraying him, because he just seemed like such a vibrant character.
Well, I found one book in the National Library about Gustavus Eyre. I don't know if everybody heard the question. It's about Gustavus Eyre, the Free Church of Scotland minister, and how I decided how to portray him. When I began reading up on Strathcarron and Greenyards and Glencalvy, his name kept popping up, and he was a genuine champion of the people. I mean, the church sometimes gets a bad name because it seemed to be often on the wrong side, shall we say, in the clearances. But especially, I think, the Free Church of Scotland ministers in that area were absolutely champions of the people who wrote letters and they raised money and they tried to make people aware of what was happening. And I just thought he was such an interesting character, and I tried to find out more about him. There's very little written about him, but there was one book I found that had some information about him, and it described his physical appearance, which was he was a very tall, imposing character, and that his congregations liked that, and they liked to have a minister that, if he was going to thump from the pulpit, he looked imposing while he was doing it. He was very keen on temperance, ran a temperance society locally, was learned, but the key thing about him, it seemed to me, was that he was a Celt himself. He was a farmer's son from Easter Ross, and he spoke Gaelic, and he had worked on the farm as a young man, but he had been to high school in Tame, and then he had got into university, went to Aberdeen University, became a minister. So he was erudite, he was extremely well educated, but he came back and he worked in this very rural strath among the townships there and among the people there. And so I just took these clues, really, about his his physical looks. He was described as having flaxen hair that was kind of back from his hair, his temple rather. And I sort of had a view of him, and that he was probably stood no nonsense, but was kind, and I could see from what he was like as an older person that he had maintained that absolute iron conviction that you can tell from his letters as a younger man, that the authorities had to treat people as human beings made in the image of God, and not, as he put it, worse than beasts. And that was the theme that you see in his letters to the newspapers. When he wrote to the newspapers about Glencalvy. He was quite a young man during the Glencalvy clearance, when he wrote to the editor of the Times, and he said that the people of Glencalvy are going to have to sleep in a graveyard. And he did it in order to raise money. He thought that people would be sorry for this situation. They would send him some money that he would be able to use for tents and tarpaulins in the graveyard, and also maybe some money for the indigent who had absolutely nothing. And the editor of the Times at that time, the famous Mr. Delaney in London, like any good editor, getting a letter like this, thought, oh, that's interesting. The people have been put out of their homes and into a graveyard. You, son, up you go and investigate it. And he sent one of his reporters. They weren't called reporters then. This guy was called a special commissioner. We don't know his name, so it's always nice when you, in your research, when there's enough not known about something to fictionalise it. You can't fictionalise too much when there's too much known history that you might flout, but we didn't know the name of this man, only that he came up from London to Glencalvy and became his reports from there became increasingly indignant and impassioned. And this was at a time when actually journalism, certainly of the more sober newspapers at the times, were not particularly emotional. But you can read his pieces, and you can see he's getting more and more kind of involved himself, and he ended up writing a whole series about the poor laws and how they were affecting ordinary people. And he wrote a very colourful piece, we would call it a colour piece today, about what the people looked like in the graveyard, and how they had set up their tents, and what happened to them, and how they went and they were given some money from the landowner to go and make their new lives, and we speculated about the fact that some of them would have been able to do something at that point, as indeed many people who were cleared did go and make new and productive lives. But he speculated that the vast majority of them would end up in penury because they had nowhere to go. They were old, or they were sick, or they were women. So this book, in a sort of a way, is a tribute to the journalists and to the ministers and to the people who put themselves out there and said, we bear witness to use the expression that James Seaman does. We bear witness to a wrong that is happening here. And a wrong, a moral wrong doesn't mean that good can't come of it, that people can't make good lives out of it. And many did. And many went to America, and we all know the stories of the hard graft there, and they're making new lives, and their descendants come back to Britain, and they're very proud of what their ancestors did, and the life of poverty they left behind to create wonderful things in another continent. But that doesn't make it right to do that to people in the first place, to uproot them, and to leave them to suffer the horrors that many of them did have to suffer in our big cities.
Any other questions? Oh.
Sally, you deal very delicately with the topic of sex. Most writers are much more open than you. The couple, you don't show them kissing ever, but actually you can read into it. Would you like to comment on how you approach the relationship of a 50-year-old woman and a 40-year-old man?
Oh, David Nichols, that wonderful novelist who's got who's one day was on Netflix recently, and I was listening to his marvellous new novel coming up in the car, and there was an interview with him the other day, and he said, I cannot and I will not write a sex scene. And I'm pretty much of the same mind. I don't know that I've ever read a particularly successful sex scene that doesn't make you want to go, oh no, don't. So I think true eroticism leaves lots to the imagination. And I'm not claiming this is an erotic novel either at all, but I think you can leave suggestions and also it was a situation in the novel where Jamesina was expecting nothing, and found that as a woman whose emotions had been frozen, or beaten out of her in her earlier life, was surprised and perhaps gratified to discover that she was still capable of desire. And I think that was as far as I went. I trying to remember. Trust you, Peter.
You have to feel sorry for the poor young man. You have to, well,
he wasn't that young. He was 44 and she was 54.
Right. Thank you very much.
Peter's wife is telling him to be quiet.
Reasonable question.
It's a very reasonable question. No, it's interesting. Yeah, but I do think by and large, I mean, just looking at other people's books, I do think that the physical side of relationships are very often better expressed in what you leave out than what you put in, by and large. Sex is funny, and it really is. It's a funny thing to do, and to describe it, you end up being funny. I'm not going there anymore.
I think we've got time for one more question. Get this lady at the front, and then we'll maybe get the lady at the back as well.
Yes. No, I was just wondering if since you've since this book's been published, and a lot of people have been reading it, have you had any person come to you and said, that they come from a family who experienced the Grignards or the Croy situation? It's because there are families. I come from a family of Rossies from Uspasdale who were cleared along to Alta-Spake. And so I know my own family history of and they were Rossies, interestingly enough. And that's my mother's family were Rossies. And I just wondered if this must have stirred a lot of people into their own family history and knowing
absolutely does and
coming back to stories, because I think that's quite fascinating how so many people, they must have some family stories still. And I think it's really interesting. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I found out about my family is only because of the internet, because you can look into Scotland's people and find out quite a lot of things about your family and your history that's online now that you can actually find. And I was just thinking, it's quite sad for my mother would be amazed at some of the information I have about her family now. And she's, and I just wish she was still alive
and it's wonderful
to share that.
We have the resources now to be able to delve into that. And every audience that I've ever spoken to about this, there's always been people that have said, you've stimulated me to think about, and I come from so and so, and this story really resonates. But there was actually the very first talk I did about this in Edinburgh when the book was published at first. There was two men about my own age in the front row, and one of them couldn't wait to put his hand up when it was time for questions, and he stood up and he said, "Sally, I just want to tell you that I'm the grandson of the baby who was born in Glencalvy Church." And that was so, I was almost speechless, because I had known there was a baby born there anecdotally, and they told me that it was a boy, and that this young man had grown up in the area and had a family in the area, and they'd moved to, I think it was Golspie they had moved to, but I tried as hard as I could to find out more, and I couldn't. And I'd forgotten all about it really. I didn't make much of it in the book, because, again, once I knew that there might be people around who knew more about it than I did, I then didn't want to fictionalise it too much in case it kind of hurt their feelings. So I hadn't really done much with it. And then for them to stand up and say, there were two brothers. And that happened a bit at Inverness as well when I did a talk there. The nearer I've got to the Highlands, talking to people, the more people have actually been Rossies or come from that area, and really, I keep thinking we are not so far away. We're 3-4 generations away from what was happening then. We are all, most of us, the product of what was happening in our history a few generations ago. And it doesn't go away, and it informs us deeply, I think, in many ways.
Just one last question then before we...
Thank you. First, I wanted to just say that the reading during the scene, thank you for writing that, and it's like a fantasy almost, seeing someone, a role behaving like that, so being as rude as that. I think that is inspiring. I really think, thank you. But I wanted to ask you if anyone, if you ever think about sort of reparations for the clearances and what that might look like, and does anyone ever ask you about that or talk about that? Is that something that ever comes up? I just think that there could be a case for something like that.
Reparations for the clearances.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not something I've been asked about. I don't know how you would do that. I don't know how you would begin to do that. It's so widespread and so many different kinds of people involved, and the governments that made the laws, and the landowners that implemented the laws, and the police authorities who made sure that the laws were carried out to the letter. And I don't think so. I think the way you make reparation for the past is not by trying to pay money, it's by taking the past into yourself and saying, this must not happen again. And let's work to make a kind of society where this or the modern equivalent cannot happen. And that I think is to get reparations for the past in a way that means something more than apologies or money or I think it's a she off the top of my head as if this is a personal opinion.
Well, thank you very much, Sally. It's been marvellous to hear all your insights and the background to the reading of this, the writing of this wonderful book. So thank you. It's been
Thank you.
a pleasure.
Can I say thank you to Shona, who's done such a lovely job of interviewing me, and she also has some great books which are here tonight as well. And it's a real privilege to be interviewed by you. So thank you.